My name is Lily, and my dream had always been to speak fluent English. Growing up in a small town in France, I knew I had to learn the language if I wanted to explore the world. So, one day, I booked my ticket to London. It wasn't just a trip. It was the beginning of a whole new chapter in my life. As I sat on the plane, staring out at the clouds, my mind was racing. This was it. I was finally going to take the leap and learn the language that had always felt so distant to me. But as I sat there, two women behind me began chatting away in English, and it hit me. I couldn't really follow their conversation. Sure, I could pick out some words, but the way they spoke so quickly, using expressions and phrases I didn't recognize, made me realize how far I had to go. Nervously, I turned around and said, "Excuse me, I'm on my way to London to learn English, but I'm struggling to understand your conversation. How did you learn?" The women looked at each other and smiled. "Oh, don't worry," one of them, named Anna, said warmly. "You're on the right track already. The key is to speak, speak, speak. The more you try to talk to people, the faster you'll learn." Her friend, Sophie, nodded. "And listen carefully to the way people speak. You'll pick up on phrases and patterns without even realizing it. Also, make friends. It's easier when you practice with someone you trust. Here, why don't we exchange numbers? We'd be happy to help you practice while you're in London." I couldn't believe their kindness. They gave me their phone numbers, and I promised to reach out. With that, my fear started melting away. I wasn't alone in this journey, and that gave me hope. When I finally landed in London, I took a deep breath and soaked in the energy of the city. The streets were alive with the sound of English being spoken everywhere. I headed straight to the language school where I'd enrolled. On my first day, I walked into the classroom and met my teacher, Mr. Clark, who greeted us all with a bright smile. "Welcome, everyone," he said. "I know learning English can seem like a huge challenge, but I have a method that will make it easier for you. It's simple, effective, and if you follow it, you'll be speaking fluently in no time." He grabbed a marker and wrote on the board, "Read, listen, think, speak." "This method has worked for hundreds of my students," he continued. "Let me explain how it works." I leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. "First, read something in English every day. It doesn't matter what it is: books, newspapers, even street signs. Reading helps you see how English is structured and introduces you to new vocabulary." I scribbled down every word he said, feeling a growing excitement. "Second, listen to as much English as you can. Whether it's music, podcasts, or conversations around you, the more you listen, the better your ear will become at picking up the natural rhythm and flow of the language." I could already see how I'd use this advice. I'd start listening to English radio and podcasts during my morning walks through London. "Third," Mr. Clark said, "you have to think in English. This one's hard at first, but it's so important. Stop translating from your native language. Start forming thoughts directly in English, and soon enough, it will come naturally." I smiled to myself, thinking of how often I'd catch myself thinking in French, trying to translate every sentence before I spoke. But this was a new approach, and I was ready to try it. "And finally," Mr. Clark said, his voice filled with enthusiasm, "you must speak. Speak as much as you can, even if you're afraid of making mistakes. That's the fastest way to improve." He paused, letting his words sink in. I knew this was going to be tough, But the idea of talking to people, practicing every day, excited me. I could already see myself having real conversations in English, something that had felt so impossible just a few days ago. After class, I was brimming with energy. I decided to head to a cafe near the school. As I sat down with my coffee, I pulled out a book I'd brought with me, a simple English novel. I'd read one page, then translate each sentence in my head, just to make sure I understood everything. I was making progress, but it was slow. Suddenly, I heard a voice beside me. "Are you reading in English?" a man asked, smiling as he sat down at the table next to mine. I nodded, a little nervous. "Yes, I'm trying to improve," I said. "That's great," he said. "I'm David. I teach English here in London, and I always tell my students that reading is one of the best ways to learn." "What's the book about?" I explained the plot to him, and to my surprise, the words started to flow out of me. It wasn't perfect, but I was speaking. David was patient and encouraged me to keep going. He gave me tips on how to practice every day. "Remember," he said, "it's all about balance. You need to read, listen, think, and speak in equal measure. Don't get stuck on just one thing. Make sure you're practicing all four, and your skills will grow faster than you think." By the end of our conversation, I felt a surge of confidence. I just had a full conversation in English with a native speaker, and it wasn't as scary as I thought it would be. Days turned into weeks, and I started following the method Mr. Clark had taught us religiously. I read the signs on the streets, picked up newspapers every morning, and even started listening to an English podcast about travel. I thought about my grocery list in English and practiced ordering food in restaurants without hesitation. But the real magic happened when I began meeting new people. I joined an English conversation group where we'd gather at a cafe every Saturday to chat in English. It was intimidating at first, but the more I spoke, the more natural it became. My new friends would laugh and encourage me when I stumbled over a word or phrase. And soon enough, I was holding conversations about everything: travel, books, food, and even deep topics like life goals. One day, I met up with Anna and Sophie, the women I'd met on the plane. We had lunch together in the heart of London, and as we talked, I realized how much I'd grown. I was speaking without fear, and I understood almost everything they said. We laughed about how lost I had felt on that flight, and they told me how impressed they were with my progress. "Lily, you've come so far," Sophie said, raising her glass. "You're practically a Londoner now." We all laughed, and I couldn't help but feel proud of myself. As the weeks went by, I grew more confident with my English, but I knew I still had a long way to go, especially with my accent. One day, during a class, a student named Thomas raised his hand. He was a tall guy from Germany, struggling with the same thing I was: his accent. "Mr. Clark," Thomas began, "I understand a lot of English now, but my accent is strong. People can tell immediately that I'm not a native speaker. How can I improve my accent?" Mr. Clark smiled, clearly happy that Thomas had asked this. "Good question, Thomas. Accents are tricky because they are shaped by the sounds we grew up hearing in our native languages, but improving your accent is possible. First, you need to listen closely to how native speakers form their sounds. Watch their mouths when they speak. Notice the shape of their lips and tongue. Also, record yourself speaking and listen back. Compare it with native speakers. I saw Thomas nodding, but I wanted to ask something too. How long does it take to change your accent? That depends, Mr. Clark said thoughtfully. It's not about completely losing your accent. Accents are part of who we are. It's more about making your speech clear and easy to understand. And with practice, you'll notice improvement over time. Don't rush it. The most important thing is to communicate confidently. That conversation stuck with me. Later that day, I started practicing by mimicking English radio hosts. I'd listen to the way they pronounced words and tried to copy their tone and rhythm. It was hard at first. I felt silly repeating sentences in my small flat. But I knew it was helping. London was exciting, but it was also expensive. My savings were running low, and I needed to find a way to support myself. One evening, while walking through the bustling streets of Camden, I noticed a small cafe with a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. It was a cozy place, filled with the smell of coffee and the hum of quiet conversations. "Excuse me," I said to the man behind the counter. "I saw your sign. Are you still looking for help?" The man smiled warmly. "Yes, we are. Have you worked in a cafe before?" I shook my head. "No, but I'm willing to learn." He introduced himself as Jack, the owner of the cafe. And after a short conversation, he hired me for a part-time cleaning job. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't care. I was just happy to have some income. The cafe turned out to be the perfect place to practice English. Every day, I'd chat with customers as I cleaned tables, and slowly, I noticed my confidence growing. People were kind and patient, and soon enough, I found myself not just cleaning, but also taking orders at the counter. One afternoon, a regular customer named Emily came in. She was a cheerful young woman who always had time for a chat. "How's your English coming along, Lily?" she asked as I handed her coffee. "Better, I think," I said with a smile. "I talk to a lot of people here, so that helps." Emily nodded. "Conversation is key. You're doing the right thing. And don't worry about making mistakes. Everyone does." Working at the cafe gave me a new way to immerse myself in English. I started picking up everyday phrases, learning new words, and hearing different accents from the diverse crowd that visited. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was an opportunity to grow. One morning in class, a student named Maria raised her hand. Maria was from Spain, and though her vocabulary was strong, she struggled with pronunciation. "Mr. Clark," she asked, "I know a lot of words, but I can't always pronounce them correctly. How can I improve?" Mr. Clark nodded. Pronunciation is all about repetition and exposure. First, you need to listen carefully to how native speakers say the words. Use tools like online dictionaries that have audio pronunciations. Repeat the words out loud, over and over again, until your mouth gets used to the movements. He then demonstrated the difference between two tricky sounds, the th in think and the s in sink. Maria followed along, and so did I. Even though it felt strange at first, I knew that focusing on these small details would make my English clearer. One day, after class, a quiet girl named Aya, who sat near the back of the room, gathered the courage to ask Mr. Clark, "How do I learn new words faster? I feel like I keep using the same words over and over." Mr. Clark smiled, clearly excited about the question. The best way to learn new words is to encounter them in different contexts. Don't just memorize lists. Use the words in real situations. For example, If you learn the word adventurous, try using it in a conversation or writing it in a sentence. Aya nodded, but looked uncertain. But what if I forget them? Repetition is key, Mr. Clark said. Use flashcards, read a lot, and expose yourself to new words frequently. Also, learn words that are relevant to your life. If you love cooking, learn vocabulary related to food. That way, the words will stick better. That night, I decided to follow his advice. I started carrying a small notebook with me everywhere I went. Anytime I heard a new word at the cafe, in class, or on the street, I'd write it down. Then I'd use the word in a conversation, trying to make it part of my daily speech. Balancing my job at the cafe and my English classes wasn't easy. There were days when I'd come home exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But I kept reminding myself why I was doing this. Every person I spoke to, every new word I learned, brought me one step closer to my goal of fluency. One evening, after a long shift, I sat in my flat, surrounded by books and notes. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophie, one of the women I'd met on the plane. "How's it going? Still practicing?" I smiled. It was nice to know that people cared about my progress. I quickly replied, "Yes, it's hard, but I'm making progress." Sophie wrote back, "Remember, it's all about the journey. You'll get there. And if you ever feel stuck, call me. We can practice together." That simple message gave me the boost I needed to keep going. One rainy afternoon, as I was finishing my shift at the cafe, I overheard two customers discussing a language exchange event happening nearby. Intrigued, I approached them, my curiosity piqued. "What's a language exchange?" I asked. A woman named Aisha, with bright eyes and an inviting smile, explained. "It's a gathering where people come together to practice different languages. You pair up with someone who speaks the language you want to learn, and you help each other. It's a fun way to improve your skills." That evening, I decided to attend the event. The venue was bustling with people from all over the world. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as I walked in. However, I quickly found a small group where everyone was eager to learn. I paired up with a man named Luca from Italy, who wanted to improve his English. "Let's help each other," he said with enthusiasm. We spent the first half hour speaking in English, discussing our backgrounds and interests. "Do you have a favorite book?" Luca asked, and I realized I had read a few in English. I told him about Pride and Prejudice, which I had enjoyed for its humor and characters. "Let's read a passage together," he suggested. We read and practiced pronunciation, and he pointed out some phrases I could use in everyday conversations. It was a brilliant way to learn. By the end of the night, I had made new friends and learned valuable expressions and vocabulary. The next week, Mr. Clark announced that we would have a grammar boot camp on Saturdays for those interested in improving our written and spoken English. I signed up immediately, eager to refine my skills. On the first day, Mr. Clark divided us into small groups and gave us a fun challenge. I want each group to write a short story using specific grammar structures: past tense, present perfect, and future tense. As we brainstormed, I felt nervous about my ability to contribute. However, as I started typing, the words flowed more easily than I expected. We decided to write about a group of friends on an adventure in London. Each person took turns writing a sentence, and I was thrilled to see how everyone's ideas blended together. After we finished, Mr. Clark had us read our story aloud. Hearing the various accents and styles in our group made me realize how diverse our experiences were, and it gave me the confidence to speak more freely. During one class, Mr. Clark emphasized the importance of listening. To speak well, you must first listen well. Engage with English media, music, podcasts, and audiobooks are excellent tools. That evening, I decided to try listening to an audiobook. I chose The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, a story about pursuing dreams. I found a version read by a native speaker with a clear voice. As I listened, I focused on the intonation and rhythm of the sentences, repeating some phrases out loud. The more I listened, the more I understood. I realized that storytelling helped me remember phrases and vocabulary. I began to look for English songs with lyrics I liked and followed along. The catchy melodies made learning new words easier. As my confidence grew, I noticed an announcement for a public speaking competition at school. It seemed daunting, but something inside me pushed me to sign up. I wanted to challenge myself further. I decided to speak about my journey of learning English and the experiences I had encountered in London. I spent days preparing my speech, practicing in front of the mirror, and recording myself to evaluate my tone and pronunciation. The day of the competition arrived, and my heart raced. I was nervous, but as I took the stage and saw the supportive faces of my classmates, I felt a surge of determination. I began my speech, sharing my struggles, triumphs, and the people who had supported me. Learning a new language is like climbing a mountain, I said. It's tough, but the view from the top is breathtaking. The applause at the end was exhilarating. I didn't win, but I gained something far more valuable: confidence in my speaking abilities. After my public speaking experience, I joined a creative writing club that met every Thursday. We would brainstorm ideas and share our writing with each other. One week, we were tasked with writing short poems. I had never written poetry before, but I was excited to try. Inspired by the sights and sounds of London, I wrote about the beauty of the city and my journey through it. Sharing my poem with the group felt vulnerable, but the encouragement I received motivated me to keep writing. The club also helped me learn new vocabulary. We discussed literary devices like metaphors and similes and how they can enhance our writing. I began to incorporate these into my stories, making my descriptions more vivid and engaging. As the months went by, I started to embrace my mistakes more. One day at the cafe, I accidentally mixed up a customer's order. I apologized profusely, and to my surprise, the customer smiled and said, "No worries, we all make mistakes." That small moment taught me an important lesson. Mistakes were a natural part of learning, and instead of letting them discourage me, I could use them as stepping stones to improve. I began to see every conversation and interaction as an opportunity to practice and grow. One Saturday, after my grammar boot camp, I received a text from Sophie. "I'll be in London next week. Can we meet?" I was thrilled. She had been so supportive during my journey. When Sophie arrived, we decided to meet at a park. As we strolled along the pathways, I eagerly shared my experiences, from the cafe job to the public speaking competition. Sophie listened intently, beaming with pride. "Lily, you've come so far. I can see the confidence in you," she said. "Have you thought about where you want to go with your English skills?" I paused to think. "I'd love to travel more, maybe even work in a company where I can use English every day." She smiled and encouraged me. Just keep pushing yourself. You're doing great. As my time in London progressed, I started contemplating my next steps. I knew I wanted to stay immersed in English, but I also wanted to explore different opportunities. One afternoon, I went to the local library and discovered a section dedicated to internships and volunteering. I picked up a brochure about an organization that helped international students adjust to life in London. They were looking for volunteers to assist with their English programs. Excited about the possibility, I decided to apply. Not only would this give me more practice, but it also felt rewarding to help others on their journey, just as I had been helped. After applying to volunteer at the organization, I was thrilled to receive an acceptance email. My first day was filled with nervous excitement. I arrived at the center, which was bustling with students from diverse backgrounds. The program aimed to help newcomers practice their English through conversation sessions. I was assigned to assist a group of students from different countries, including Ahmed from Egypt and Maria from Spain. During our sessions, I found myself sharing my learning experiences while encouraging them to practice speaking. Ahmed struggled with pronunciation, often asking, "How can I make my accent sound more natural?" I recalled the advice Mr. Clark had given us about listening. "Try listening to native speakers and imitate their sounds," I suggested. "It might feel funny at first, but it helps." We practiced together, repeating sentences and phrases until he felt more comfortable. One day, while I was volunteering, I ran into Mr. Clark. He was visiting to see how the program was running. "Lily, it's great to see you here. How are you finding the experience?" "I love it. I get to practice my English and help others at the same time," I replied, my face lighting up. Mr. Clark smiled and said, "Teaching is one of the best ways to learn. You're doing fantastic work." His words filled me with pride, and I realized how much I had grown since arriving in London. One afternoon, Maria asked, "How can I learn new words quickly? I feel overwhelmed by all the vocabulary." I remembered a technique I had learned in class, keeping a vocabulary journal. Why not start a journal? Write down new words you encounter, along with their meanings and example sentences. Reviewing them regularly can help you remember. We all decided to create our own vocabulary journals during our next session. Each week, we would share our favorite new words and use them in sentences. This activity not only expanded our vocabulary, but also fostered a sense of community. As our sessions continued, we grew closer as friends. One day, we discussed exploring more of London. "Let's plan a trip to the British Museum," suggested Ahmed. "It will be a fun way to practice our English and learn more about history." Excited about the idea, we organized a weekend outing. On the day of our trip, we spent hours wandering through the museum, marveling at ancient artifacts. We practiced our English by describing what we saw and discussing our thoughts on the exhibits. At one point, I found myself explaining the Rosetta Stone to a couple of tourists. "This stone helped us understand Egyptian hieroglyphs," I said, feeling a sense of pride in my knowledge. My friends chimed in with their insights, showcasing our growing confidence in speaking English. One evening, while returning from a group outing, I received a call from my landlord. "Lily, I need to discuss your rent. There's been an increase, and I understand if it's a problem," he said. My heart sank. I was already struggling financially with my part-time job. I thought about the possibility of moving, which made me anxious. I shared my concerns with Sophie during our weekly catch-up. "Maybe you can look for a roommate or another job," she suggested. I realized she was right. I began searching for affordable housing options and considered picking up additional hours at the cafe. Around this time, our school announced an accent reduction workshop. "This will be helpful for anyone looking to improve their pronunciation," Mr. Clark said during an announcement. I decided to join, eager to refine my accent. The instructor, Miss Chen, was an energetic and supportive teacher. "We'll focus on the sounds that are often challenging for non-native speakers," she explained. The workshop included various exercises, from tongue twisters to rhythm and intonation practice. I felt a little shy at first, but as I worked through the exercises with my classmates, I started to feel more confident. At the end of the workshop, we had to present a short speech. I prepared a short story about my journey learning English, and I was surprised by how much my accent had improved. The feedback from Miss Chen and my peers motivated me to continue practicing. As time went on, I balanced my volunteer work, studies, and part-time job. I kept pushing myself to practice English daily, whether through conversations, reading, or listening. Each day was a new opportunity for growth, and I felt more connected to London and its people. I looked forward to every interaction, knowing that each conversation brought me closer to my goal of fluency. I realized that learning English was not just about the language itself, but also about the relationships I built and the experiences I cherished.